Rose Cottage Notions, where we talk about historical sewing, history bounding, courage, and creativity. Today I'm going to share with you one of my research passions, the Merovingian clothing and material culture. By sharing some of my early efforts at Merovingian clothing and what I've learned since making the garments, I hope to open a window for you into a lost world. A number of years ago, I became interested in the Merovingian culture, partly because of the whole Jesus bloodline thing. Yeah, I was a kid and I love those kinds of fantasy stories. I even wanted to join the Rosicrucians at one point. I think I was intrigued by the thought of something so important being done over the centuries by dedicated people down through their lineages. That was just so cool. Like the Magi in the movie The Mummy. Yes, it seems like a lot of work, but many important things, like this YouTube channel, are worth the effort. During graduate school, I became intrigued in the real history of the Merovingians because very little was known and very little of that was published in English. Most of the scant research available was in German, French, or other languages, and often ignored textiles to ogle the gold and precious artifacts. We've all heard the horror stories of early archaeologists who cleaned the precious metal artifacts of the detritus of ancient textiles. And the graves were pillaged by grave robbers and decimated by an 18th and 19th century Merovingian craze amongst the fashionable, and dare I say it, the Illuminati. Hundreds of grave sites were dug up without care for historical context or conservation of fragile textiles and other important to us now artifacts. There just wasn't a deep research bench or many existing artifacts to study. I would look longingly at all those later period clothing in the museums and be a tad bit jealous of the rich treasures there. Now I love a challenge, so I set myself to better understanding the role of women in the Merovingian society, their material culture and dress. I make no claims to expertise in this subject, only a deep fascination and desire to reproduce the clothing for my own historical reenactment. I'm sure to get something wrong, so please share more information in the comments below. In this video, I'll bring together current research to gain a better understanding of the context of Arnagan's burial and the textiles that comprised her burial garments. I will share my own reconstruction and how I would do things differently if I had unlimited resources. Many of the textiles used in the burial garments of Arnagan can't be found commercially today. I've had to adapt and use the best available materials to try to approximate the look. I have yet to find a spin pattern linen or sheer wool gauze that was used in the time period. In this video, I'm going to share the garments that I made based on the textiles discovered in the grave at Saint Denis. Much of the garment construction and design is conjectural and is based on the few existing garments from the time period. I made some of these clothes a number of years ago and have made some additions and upgrades since then. I'm going to concentrate on a few main garments: the underdress, the kaftan or coat, the mantle, and conjectural veils. In 1959, archaeologists began excavating under the Cathedral of Saint Denis in Paris, the resting place of the kings and queens of France since the 12th century. They found a rich trove of undisturbed bodies in stone sarcophagi dating back to the 4th and 5th century. One stone sarcophagus contained the body of a woman. The woman bore a ring inscribed with the name Arnagundus. It is thought to be Arnagan, wife to Clotaire and mother of King Chilperic. What is Merovingian? For most people, their only exposure to anything Merovingian is the character from the Matrix movies and the very eldritch and fancy neckwear that the character wore. But so much fantastical lore is wrapped up in the whole bloodline of Christ thing, which makes for great entertainment, but not so much with the rigorous academic research. So let's drag ourselves back to reality. The Merovingian culture from the late 5th century to the late 8th century northern Gaul is named after the semi-mythical ruler Merovech. Very little is known about the early years of the kingdom, said to be founded by Clovis, who ruled from 482 to 511. The Merovingians held sway over what is now Belgium, northern France, and the Rhineland, to the Loire and east across the Rhine. Recent research goes beyond the semi-mythology of nebulous beginnings to shine a light on a rich, multi-ethnic society. The inheritors of the sub-Roman world, they wove a new, vibrant culture with ties across the Western Isles, Northern Europe, east past the Mediterranean centers, and beyond. The Merovingian culture was succeeded by the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne in 800. As often happens when one dynasty succeeds another, the narrative of the story is shaped by politics. The Carolingians were no different in their need to legitimize themselves by downplaying the influence of the Merovingian dynasty and culture. Sure, they were a bloodthirsty lot, but then who wasn't in that time period? The Merovingians successfully maintained many of the Roman political and religious institutions which set the stage for the success of the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne. Who was Arnagan? We know very little about the lives of women in ancient history. This is especially true in the early Middle Ages, where very little information about women remains in the written or archaeological records. We know of Arnagan because of who she married. Clotaire I was the son of Clovis I and was born around the beginning of the 5th century. Clotaire apparently really didn't believe in monogamy, moving between various wives, queens, and concubines. He was first married to Guntook, Queen of Orleans and widow of Clodomir, his brother. Then he married Ingund, who asked him to find a husband for her sister, Arnagan. Arnagan had poliomyelitis as a child, and this may have made it difficult for her to be advantageously married. So Clotaire married her sometime after the 530s. A number of years later, Clotaire repudiated Arnagan and he married Princess Radegund. So yeah, lots of wives, killing family members, invading neighboring territories, founding monasteries, all in a day's work for a Merovingian monarch. Like Catherine Parr surviving Henry VIII, Radegund and Arnagan both survived Clotaire. So there's that. Arnagan became the great-grandmother of the last Merovingian king to wield power, Dagobert. Arnagan was buried in the royal crypt at Saint-Denis near Paris. Radegund later founded a monastery and was later sainted. The archaeology of Saint-Denis. The Merovingian burials from the Basilica of Saint-Denis, Paris, were first excavated by Edouard Salon in the 1950s and then by Michael Fleury later in the decade, and then by other excavators up until about the 1980s. The graves were situated under the nave of the church. Sarcophagus 49 was opened in 1959 by Michel Fleury and attributed to Queen Arnagan because the skeleton had a finger ring with her name and title engraved on it, Arnagundus Regine. Unfortunately, many of the artifacts were poorly conserved, and the radiographies, photographs, drawings, and notes of the original investigations are missing. These finds were essentially forgotten until much later. Antoinette Rast-Eicher and Sophie Desrosiers completed a new analysis of the textiles in the early 2000s. You can find references in the description below. The textiles were very damaged from poor conservation care in the 1950s, but the researchers were able to piece together new information with a multidisciplinary approach. The new investigation showed that the queen was older than had been thought previously and had suffered from polio as a child. She died around the age of 60, possibly from dysentery in 580, a mere few years before her son, King Chilperic. The archaeological finds and my reconstructions. Whenever we study clothing found in graves, we must understand the context of funerary and grave goods. Everything put into a grave was put there by someone other than the deceased. There is a rich cultural meaning to the deposits of food and drink, the care of the dead through embalming, and other ritual and traditional acts. Arnagan did not dress herself for the grave. Her body was embalmed through a fluid of spices and aromatic herbs. Hey, ask a mortician. Let's chat. The Underlayers. With the Underlayers, we use a lot of conjecture. There really isn't much more than scraps and bits of textiles from the area. There are the few surviving garments, and I'll talk about those in future videos and later in this video, but we can use imagery from around the same time period as guides for these underlayers. There are several sources for possible garment construction that we can use as a guide. These secondary sources may not be entirely accurate for a variety of reasons, but often reflect the prevailing style of when they were made. One such are the mosaics of Justinian and Theodora in the Basilica San Vitale. You can see narrow cuffs on the sleeves of the underdresses. The garments seem to fall away from the body in straight lines and were probably rectangularly shaped. The basilica was built in 547, so the artist would have been roughly contemporary with Arnagan. Another source is the constellar diptych of Constantinius from around 410. In the lower panel depicting Germanic captives, the women are shown with an undergarment with narrow sleeves. They appear to be wearing a peplum-style overdress. This peplum overdress would have been closed with a pair of fibula at the shoulders. If we look at the embroideries on the chasuble of Bathilde in the Alfred Bono Museum in Shell, we can see two motifs with human figures, one playing the tong cymbals and another in an oratory pose. Both figures are highly stylized, but you can see the narrow sleeve width at the cuff. Bathilde was queen about 100 years after Arnagan, so she's she's roughly contemporary. We have an extant sleeve in the burial dress of Bertil of Chelles. She died in the later 7th century and was buried in this dress. The pieces that survived were a bit of the sleeve and some of the lower portion of the dress. The brown silk has a set of woven stripes at the wrist and lower hem, and the sleeve hem had a narrow band of card weaving decorating it. We don't know how many layers of garments Arnagan and women of this time period wore. She could have been wearing a thin fabric next to her skin and more costly fabric for the fashion garment. There were several layers of garments underneath the kaftan that could have been dresses or tunics, and some of these were tabbies or plain weaves. Some were of wool, others of linen and silk. It's possible that these dresses or tunics were lined or consisted of multiple layers. Rectangular construction. To make both the underdress and the kaftan, I used a method known as rectangular construction. This method uses rectangles and triangles to create the garment. In these early periods, clothing was very different from the clothing we wear today with our set-in sleeves and abundance of curves and darts to fit the garment. Rectangular construction is a very efficient use of the fabric, and there's very little waste left over. In this period, fabric was generally woven to the final width of the garment. Silks were imported from Byzantium or further east. The Merovingians also had a rich tradition of producing linen and woolen cloth. Sometimes you can find exotic fibers, such as those used in the shroud of Arnagan, which included beaver fur fibers. One of my unicorn fabrics that I have been looking for a really long time is a spin-patterned plain weave linen. Both S and Z twist yarn is used, which creates really subtle patterns of checks and stripes. I just haven't been able to find it anywhere. I've used linen that has a subtle pattern, but that was based on weave structure and not on directional twist of the yarn. I have two dresses that I wear with this kaftan, one a grass green linen and the other a red silk linen blend. The silk linen blend has yellow linen for the warp and red silk for the weft. Several of the textiles in the grave finds have mixed fibers, although that could be also from a degradation and mixing of fibers. The red dress that I made a number of years ago is getting a wee bit tight, but if I just want to stand around and look pretty, it does the trick. This is also a cautionary tale about why period cut and construction is a bit more forgiving for weight fluctuations. The design of the garments that I made a while back are more fitted than was usual in the time period because, well, vanity. A more faithful garment design could be seen in the garment of the Aachen Cathedral called the Dress of the Virgin. This garment is earlier than Arnagan lived, but is nearly a complete garment. The width of the body and the sleeve suggests that it could have been worn as an overdress, but we can look at the general construction for suggestions on how to make a dress for Arnagan. I have diagrammed the Aachen dress because I plan to recreate it in the future. You can see that the body of the dress is a rectangle and has no shoulder seam. It is one piece of fabric with the neckline reinforced with facing and embroidery. The wrist end of the sleeve is missing, but the sleeve width tapers to narrow towards the wrist. There's a gore on each side with a slit, which is again reinforced with embroidery. The kaftan. The most significant garment was an open front coat or kaftan. The long coat was a weft face half silk tabby. A leather belt lay over this garment. An evidence showed that the kaftan went at least down to low to mid calf and may have been lined. The main textile had two types of fibers, silk and linen, one being the warp and the other the weft. Its colors were conjectured to be purple and red. It was bordered along the front opening by tablet weaving of at least 100 tablets and is about 6.5 centimeters wide. The tablet weaving had diamond and lozenge patterns with a madder-dyed supplementary brocade weft. The band is brocaded with triple silk thread, Z-spun, and displays the pattern of diagonal and lozenges. This wide band was bordered by a simple tabby band of 16 warp threads. The kaftan has wide cuffs of imported blue and possibly yellow samite from Byzantium or Persia. The samite has been woven with a warp proportion of 2:1. Over the samite there is a laid gold thread embroidery of rosettes and bees. There are still a few tiny stitches that could indicate the color of the textile underneath the embroidery. The decoration of the cuff resembles the tablet woven ornamentation of the women buried in Sutton Hoo Mound 14. Also, we've seen this in other finds. This suggests that this cuff ornamentation could have been haute couture for royal women. Arnagan's death and burial come at a time when fashions were changing in the late 6th to early 7th century. Earlier costumes used a series of brooches to close open front garments. Later fashions resembled those in the Stuttgart Psalter with a closed tunic with a single large brooch at the neckline. The kaftan and all the rest of the garments are well within the Merovingian tradition of 6th century garments. The mantle and headwear. The mantle was made of imported samite, which is a weft-faced compound twill. The main threads of the warp are hidden on both sides by the fabric by floats of the ground and patterning wefts. The samite of the veil was a figured red and yellow. According to Fleury and Lanord, it is probably a veil as it was found on the head and shoulders. There was also gold threads on the head from a small decoration. There may have been some other fine textile used as a veil or braid with gold thread or a headband. The fabric I used is samite from the Sartor Bohemia fabrics. I'll link below, but hide your wallets before you go there. This is a reproduction of an 8th century Byzantine silk samite. While the date of this Sartor fabric is a little bit after Arnagan lived, the design is plausible for an early 6th century textile. I cut the samite fabric in a semicircle based on the finds from the Shell Abbey. There is a woolen mantle there that was part of the grave finds of Queen Batilde. The original is in wool with an edge of tablet woven fringe. I plan to make this garment in the future. I have the wool, I just need to light a fire under my tuchus to finish the tablet weaving fringe. It's likely that this veil would have been put over other veils and wraps and secured with pins and ribbons. Samite is a fairly heavy fabric and would need to be anchored somehow. Gold threads were found near her head, but we don't know if she was wearing a gold brocaded headband, had gold threads in her hair, or if there were gold threads couched on the veil. I have thin, fine hair, so I often use hair pieces. This is something that has been done for millennia. We have false hair pieces from the Gallo-Roman period found in a grave in France, and I'm fairly certain that hair pieces would have been used by Merovingian women if necessary. For my own experimentation, I made a square of patterned linen to approximate the spin pattern linen. I made a narrow linen band with gold thread couched down using silk thread, a small veil of silk, and the larger mantle of samite. The square linen piece provides the secure surface to attach the veils to. There is still some debate what these underlayers would look like. I'm using it like a kerchief because I need a good way to anchor the heavier fabric of the silk. This way of wearing could be entirely anachronistic, but it's what works for me. Vita, or narrow card woven or embroidered bands, were often worn by the women of this period. It could have been used as a headband flat across the forehead or worn to wrap around the hair and to provide another way of securing the veils. Visual sources show both possibilities. Thank you for the gift of your time today, and I hope you found something of value. Making videos to share my passion for historical costume and history bounding really is one of the bright spots of my day. If you are of a generous mind, please consider checking out the ways to support this channel below. And as always, I bid you joy.